What's up, book nerds? It's Kirsten and welcome back to my channel. I'm bringing you guys today my January reading wrap-up. So it is a winter wonderland outside today. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius. I hate it. It's chilly and bright and white and snowy, and I hate it. Despite being Canadian, I am not a winter person. I do not live for the snow and the cold, so I am inside, hiding away from the winter that is happening out there, and I just figured while I'm indoors and hiding, why don't we talk about some books? In the month of January, I read 13 books, which does sound pretty impressive. However, a lot of those are the Ghosts of the Shadow Market novellas. So all in all, I think I actually ended up having a bit of a lighter reading month this month. But January was the month that I started back at school, and I've been picking up a whole bunch of extra shifts at work, so it's been really busy. So I'm still pretty happy with the amount that I've read this month. So starting out the month of January, I actually finished a book that I had started in December, and that book was Lord of Shadows by Cassandra Clare. I ended up just loving Lord of Shadows so much. This might be one of my favorite, if not my #1 favorite, Cassandra Clare book. I just loved how the plot came about and the development for all of the characters. I was so invested in everybody's story, which isn't really common for me. I normally end up picking like 1 or 2 favorite characters in a book like this that kind of tells a lot of different stories, and only caring about those 1 or 2 characters, and everybody else I'm normally just kind of like reading to get through it so that I can get to the characters that I actually care about. But that wasn't the case with Lord of Shadows. I actually really cared about everyone's story, and I wanted to know what happened to everybody, and everybody deserved really good things, and I was so invested in this entire book. I gave Lord of Shadows 5 out of 5 stars. There is not a whole lot that I would change about it. I understand a lot of people think it's kind of slow to start, and there's like a lot of time spent kind of explaining things in the beginning so that it can get to the action in the second half. However, I really still enjoyed the pace in the beginning, so I really don't have anything about this story that I would change. Next up in the month of January, I picked up the only book that I ended up receiving for Christmas, and that book was the screenplay for The Crimes of Grindelwald. I was so excited to pick this story up, mostly because I ended up leaving the movie theater after seeing the movie a little bit skeptical, if that's the right word for it. There was a lot of things in the movie that when I left the theater, I was kind of going like, did J.K. Rowling actually do this? Like, there was so many thinker moments that I'm kind of just curious about. Who was the McGonagall that was at the school? Because Minerva McGonagall wasn't born yet. This was 8 years before Minerva McGonagall was born. Her mum wasn't a witch. It was her dad's side that was magical and her mom's side that were muggles, if I remember correctly. And so I'm just really curious as to who that McGonagall was. Also, am I right in remembering that Dumbledore never taught Defense Against the Dark Arts? Didn't he always want to stay away from the dark arts? That Dumbledore taught Transfiguration. Am I wrong? Either way, I was really excited to pick this up, and all in all, I ended up really enjoying this read. I don't think I'll ever not enjoy something that J.K. Rowling writes. It was magical and whimsical and everything that I hoped it would be. Not to mention, I am living for the little illustrations that were in here. So, like, there's our little Eiffel Tower. My favorite has to be this one, which is also really close to the beginning, and it is this little illustration of a threstrel. I just think it's dark and creepy, but also magical and whimsical looking, and I like it a lot. So even though I have some issues with the story, which may or may not be resolved in the coming movies and screenplays, I still ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars because I did really enjoy it. I'm always going to enjoy going back into the Potter universe. Next up, I had the opportunity to read an advanced reader's copy of The Last Life of Prince Alistair, which is of course the sequel to The Dreadful Tale of Prosper Redding. I originally read Prosper Redding quite a while ago, and I really enjoyed it. It gave me the absolute best sort of like throwback vibes to reading Halloween-y stories when I was in middle school and elementary school. It was just the perfect sort of spoopy vibe. It just really reminded me of my time reading the books like the Bartimaeus trilogy and Harry Potter and Percy Jackson and all of these middle grade stories that I think really could be enjoyed by older audiences. I gave Prince Alistair 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed enjoyed it. It had the same sort of great spoopy vibe that the first one had, and I really loved getting more character development and more development of the magical world that the books are set in. I'm going to try to keep the synopsis not too spoilery for the first book in case you haven't read it. In this sequel, we follow the boys, Prince Alistair and Prosper Redding, as they go to the demon realm. Our human main character has to go and save his sister, and he enlists the help of Prince Alistair, and Prince Alistair agrees to it only if Prosper Redding will agree to like stay in the realm afterwards and like owe him. But then when they get to the demon realm, they are both out of their element because it is nothing like how Prince Alistair remembers it. There has been this sort of group try to take control, and now Prince Alistair is just as in danger and just as lost in what would have been his home world as Prosper Redding is in this place that he's never been. It was a wonderful sequel, and it did such a good job in keeping that same spoopy aesthetic. I loved it so much, and if you liked the first book, you will definitely enjoy the sequel. And if you haven't read the first book yet, but you enjoy these sort of like atmospheric fantasy stories, then I definitely suggest giving it a try. Don't let the fact that it's middle grade like sway you from reading it, because I really think that anybody could enjoy these two books. Okay, I'm back. I don't know why I feel the need to tell you guys that I've left and come back, because when you watch the video, you won't really be able to tell if I left or not. Like, it's all cut together. You don't have this big empty space when I was gone. I was just starting to feel that this book chat was missing a hot beverage, so I went and made myself a coffee and got myself a water, and so now I am ready to talk about books. Okay, also, 10 house points to anybody who can guess what is in this cup. Do I give a hint, or is that gonna make it too easy? I give a hint, I think. Hint, it's like drinking a chocolate bar. Anybody who can guess in the comments down below what is in this, I will give 10 house points to. So next, in the month of January, I started to pick up the short stories in the Ghosts of the Shadow Market. Previously, every time that I read one of these short story bind-ups from Cassie Clare or an anthology of short stories from somebody else, I have a really hard time rating the book because I always end up trying to do it of all of the stories. And in no matter what, any sort of short story compilation, you're going to enjoy some more than others. So it's always really hard to talk about how much you enjoyed a bind-up after reading it. I listened to the audiobook of each of these short stories on SCRIBD, and doing so just gave me this opportunity to separate each of the stories in my mind. So for the purpose of this review, I am going to separate each short story from the others and talk about them and their rating as their own separate story. So the first book in the Ghosts of the Shadow Market is Son of the Dawn by Cassandra Clare. This book was not how I was expecting this collection to start. It was a really nice surprise though. So in this first story, we get to see when Jace comes to the Lightwoods. But it was just this really great, really fun sort of story, because not only do we get to see young Jace, but we also get to see the Lightwood siblings and the parents as they are welcoming Jace, and we get to see how Jace was already this like headstrong, sort of stubborn, golden-haired boy right from this really young age. I really enjoyed Son of the Dawn. I'm pretty sure I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. And then we have the second book in the Ghosts of the Shadow Market series, and that was Cast Long Shadows. Cast Long Shadows was definitely one of my favorite of the short stories. I gave it 5 stars. This short story followed Matthew Fairchild and his Parabatai James Herondale, and I just love everything to do about these two characters and this entire generation of shadow hunters, so I was really excited to pick up this short story and find that it was about them. I think Matthew is a really interesting character, and I really liked getting this a little bit more of a look into him as a character, because we're about to get an entire series of these characters, this entire generation, and I love how much information we have about them before even picking up the first book of this series. Book number 3 in the series is called Every Exquisite Thing. I did really like it. I think I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. My problem with it was actually just how strong the insta-love was. Like, it was present in this story. But what it lacked in romantic development, which is really hard to accomplish in such a short story, of course, it really made up for with like this really badass, diverse cast of characters with really great LGBT rep and this really amazing supportive family dynamic that you don't get to see very often in young adult literature. This was just a really great supportive family that I loved reading. But yes, in this third story, we have a female-female romance and a sort of gender fluid queer character who I really enjoyed as a character. She was strong and a badass, and she was just so incredibly herself and unapologetically herself that I really enjoyed reading from her perspective. But the real winning factor about this story for me was definitely the family dynamic. I don't want to say too much because that would be a spoiler, but it was just really cool seeing this family interact. And then we have Learn About Loss, which is the fourth of the Ghosts of the Shadow Market series. This was, I think, my least favorite of the stories, which doesn't really say a whole lot because I think I still gave it like 3.5 stars. I still really did enjoy it. This is the one that we really start to like commit to this overarching plot from the short stories about finding out the story behind the lost Herondale. I really did like it. It just wasn't as good as the other ones. I wasn't as invested in the new characters that we had or even in the story of the older characters that we already know, but like it was still an interesting read, and you definitely do need to have that information moving on with the series. And next was A Deeper Love. A Deeper Love, which is book 5, was I think absolutely my favorite of the short stories in this bind up. In this short story, we follow Tessa Gray. It's mostly from her sort of perspective, and it's set during World War II when she is a nurse. At this point in the timeline, Will has passed. Tessa is acting as a nurse during World War II. I loved the atmosphere and I loved the emotions that we felt with the different characters, and I loved seeing our main character, the way that he is struggling with gripping his humanity and remembering himself. I loved Tessa as a character, like as a protagonist in this one. I just loved reading from her point of view as she is like friends with Katerina Loss, and the two of them are just trying to be nurses and help people during World War II, and you can see like the ugliness of war and of like how terrible humanity can really be. I enjoyed this short story so much. I absolutely adored it, and I was really glad that I had read it before Queen of Air and Darkness, just for this like extra bit of perspective. It was definitely a 5-star read for me, and I loved it so much. In book 6, we get even more of a bit of a background look at Jace as a character, even though it's before he was born. This will be spoilery, so you know, like, just if you don't want to be spoiled for like some of the plot line, then maybe just come back at the time that will be posted here on the screen. Okay, but for those of you who won't be spoiled, do you remember like how Amethyst had been in love with the Herondale and they were together, and then all we really know is that Valentine made Stephen Herondale break up with her, supposedly because of her relation to Luke, who is now a werewolf at that point. This really focuses on that story. We get the entire background and all of the reasoning that went into Stephen having to break up with Amethyst and why he gets together with Celine, and we get to see Celine as a character who is of course Jace's mom. So it was really interesting being able to see like why they ended up together and like what that relationship actually looked like, and just like this sort of background information about Jace that like we didn't really have beforehand, which was really cool. So then book 7, The Land I Lost, we get to see from Alec's perspective from when he is sent to Buenos Aires. He goes there to sort of rebuild some of the Shadowhunter community after the Dark War, and we really get to see some more of his interactions with the Downworld and between him and his family, and him and Magnus getting kids. And it's this great little look into his adult life and what that really looks like, with him being this sort of representative in between Downworld and the Shadowhunter community. And then the final book that is out as of right now, which is book 8, is called Through Blood Through Fire. When the bind up is published, it will have another 2 stories in it, equaling a grand total of 10. And I am really excited, of course, to get those last 2 stories. And in this 8th book, this is also very spoilery, so come back in like 30 seconds when I'm done talking about it. At this time, in this short story, we get to see Tessa and Jem be reunited after being separated for over a century. And it was just really great and heartwarming, and I really loved this short story just because I loved being able to experience their reunion with them. And it gave a lot more information that was really good to have before going into Queen of Air and Darkness, as they keep looking for and get more information about the Lost Herondale. So that is all of the reading that I accomplished from Ghosts of the Shadow Market, and that caught me up to all of the Shadowhunter stuff that has been published so that I could go into Queen of Air and Darkness with as much information as possible. Before picking up Queen of Air and Darkness, somewhere in the middle of all of those short stories, I was at home for a couple of days and had the chance to do some physical reading, and so I took a small break from the Shadowhunter Chronicles and picked up my arc of Blood Witch by Susan Dennard. Blood Witch is one of my most highly anticipated releases for 2019. I am trash for the Witchland series. I absolutely could not wait to immerse myself back into this world and get all of this information because I am in love with these characters so much. For those of you who don't know, Blood Witch is the 4th book in the series. It follows our character Aedwin, or Baedwin as the internet has dubbed him. I was sent this arc from Tortine to read and review, and I was just so excited to receive it, and I could not wait to pick it up. I tried to push back reading it a little bit until it was a little bit closer to the release date so that I wouldn't be like finished it and needing to talk to people about it way before other people had picked it up. But I was enthralled in this entire story right from the very beginning. I had such a hard time putting it down once I started reading. It was an amazing sequel. In this book, you get even more character development and world development, and I just love this world so much. I'm pretty sure this is going to end up being my favorite of the series so far. I just enjoyed it so much. The world is just so rich and atmospheric, and this plot had me guessing the entire way through. Like, if you think you know what's gonna happen in this book, just throw it out the window because you're wrong. Nobody knows. Like, you can't possibly know. You will be surprised. You will definitely be surprised with this entire story, because I mean, I definitely was, at least. But this is just such an amazing fantasy series that I absolutely suggest to anybody who enjoys fantasy. The magic that works in this world is just so creative and original, and I love the world building, and these characters had me wrapped around their little fingers. I just love this series so much, and I want everybody to read and love them as much as I do. Which brings us to my final book, which is a long time coming. I started binge reading the Shadowhunter books in an effort to catch up on them all the way back in November, I think, with definitely some breaks in between to read other stories. But all of this reading was literally just to get me to the point where I could read Queen of Air and Darkness by Cassandra Clare. This book, you guys, holy crap. First of all, this, I mean, it speaks for itself. That is a story and a half. That is 2 stories. That is a large book. This book is 875 pages, but then it also has a sort of like little bonus chapter at the end that follows Jason Clary. So it's like a 900-page book. I ended up having to go out and grab this copy, even though it doesn't match the series that I have, like the series that I've collected for book 1 and 2, which I guess is technically the UK paperback, the paperbacks that have the runes on the binding. However, I knew that as soon as I picked this up, I was not going to be able to put it down, that I was going to want to read it as like quickly as possible because I was going to be so immersed in the story. I was just so invested in all of the characters and the storyline because of the way that book 2 ended. So I could not wait to pick up book 3. So I went ahead and picked up this copy, which doesn't match book 1 and 2 on my shelf, but that's okay because I knew I was going to want to bounce back and forth between the physical copy reading and the audiobook when I was at work and driving to and from work. I finished this book, this almost like this 900-page book in 2 days because I could not put it down. I started it on a Thursday morning and then finished it like the Friday night. It was a wonderful sequel. For non-spoilery comments, I will just say that it was a really great sequel and it really did wrap up like everything that you want to know about, and I definitely think at least that it picked up on the actual story so much faster than books 1 and 2. A lot of the people who say that they have a hard time reading through Cassandra Clare books because they're always so slow to start. That definitely wasn't the case for this one. It picked up right into the plot right away. We already had characters with missions and our little group of main characters being separated and everything right from the beginning. It was already really high tension story. And this is another one that, like, I had a pretty good idea, I thought, on where the story would end up going and like what to expect from it, and I was wrong. 100% of it was just like not what I thought it was going to be, and it was just so much better. I loved the way that this story had me guessing the entire way through. I was just like holding my breath in anticipation, waiting to see what happened with this book. Overall, I was really happy with this story. There were a couple of things that I didn't exactly love that I will leave for the spoilery talks in a minute, but for the most part, I did really enjoy it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. So I'm just going to talk about spoilers quick for the next like 30 seconds, so come back at this time. If you have finished Queen of Air and Darkness, I would love to have a discussion with you in the comments down below. Come and let me know what you thought, what your favorite parts were, what some problems that you had with it were, if you had any at all. Just maybe like tag them like right at the top as spoilers, just so that anybody else who might stumble upon them doesn't get spoiled for this book. What I want to talk about isn't actually all that spoilery, but for the most part, I was really satisfied with everything in this book and the way that everything was wrapped up. There wasn't a whole lot that near the end of the book that I was still wondering about. Of course, one of the biggest things though is just the way that the entire story ended for Ty and Kit. Now, having finished the book and looked into it, I now realize that Kit is going to get his own trilogy, and so it makes total sense as to why their story wasn't really concluded in a way that I was expecting. But the first book of that trilogy isn't expected to be published until like 2022, which is just so far away, and so I think I really would have enjoyed a little bit more closure just for these two characters and their storyline, especially since so much of their story in this book was just so like grief-stricken, and Ty just in general just did not have a whole lot of closure in this book. So I really would have enjoyed being able to see just a little bit more of a wrap-up, a little bit more like of a satisfying ending for those two characters, even though we were expecting an entire trilogy about them in the future. But yes, if you have read this book and you have any thoughts, concerns, things that you were satisfied with or things that you weren't, I would love to hear about it. So do come and talk to me in the comments down below, because I would love to hear everybody's opinion about this conclusion for this really amazing trilogy. And that is all of the books that I read in the month of January. So while it was like technically 13 books, since all of those short stories will one day be bound up and equal 1 book, it was really more like 6 books in total, which I am still really happy with. I still think that is a good amount of reading to have accomplished in a month that I was working full-time and taking full-time classes. I would love to hear what you read and loved or hated in the month of January. So if you read any of these books or anything else that you really enjoyed, come let me know in the comments down below. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for my next video. Bye!